Okay guys, I recently found myself immersed into the independent animation industry, and that is all perpetuated by the amazing digital Circus, a cartoon that has completely blown up all over the animation media. And I think with how clever it has been with its writing, its popularity is warranted its praise. What's up everybody, this is Willie, and here I am talking about the amazing digital Circus, a popular adult indie animation made by Glitch, and it's a show that I didn't know much about it ever since its first release, which has been over 2 years ago, and what really caught my attention is when I started seeing a lot more clips of it being posted on social media, alongside some fan art that I came across that truly pulled my attention onto this show. And just recently, I finally got the time to do a binge watch through all 6 episodes that were currently released as of this recording, and now coming out of it, I fully understand why it is so popular, which elicits how its episodes have been able to successfully accumulate more than 1 million views, with its pilot episode gaining a whopping 399 million views, which is just insane, but also clearly epitomizes the worthiness of this show, and I genuinely like this show. But to briefly run down what the amazing digital Circus is, it's a show that centers around human characters who would find themselves trapped inside a digital circus where they engage in activities and such strange adventures, and this show really pertains to a lot of the themes of existential horror that does lead to a lot of the dark comedy surrounding this show, on top of the whole wackiness that makes the humor come off very fresh too, and especially for a kind of show that is tailored toward a much more older mature audience like myself, so it does makes this show really worth its value. On top of that, what I like about what this show does is the psychological elements too that make such great resonation with the audience, where the show's theme centers around a lot of the human emotion and mental health that does really push for those kind of facets to be valued, and it does bring a lot of good validation. And on top of that, these characters that we got have such a great portrayal on the show, where they don't come off extremely cartoonish and are portrayed to actually feel like real humans, that makes them all very sympathetic, that develops our investment in them as characters. We grow this really strong bond for them as we are attached with the complexities of their experience and struggles, which does really maintain their humanity side of things as humans imprisoned in a virtual world. Nevertheless, the amazing digital Circus in a nutshell is a very solid independent animation that does not feel like it leans heavily too much on tropes and actually evokes such great fun, combined with some interesting exploration on the psychological complexities. This is exactly what makes this show very inspiring with its unique lore, and to illustrate all of that, I can make an in-depth run-through of every available episode to make a detailed analysis on them and their strengths that help pertain to the show's success. So this show begins with our main character, a Gesture, who becomes a new member of this digital circus that she unexpectedly got herself trapped in. And the constant panic and terror in her voice greatly captures the immediate tone of the unsettling nature of this digital circus. But anyways, while we still have her processing the new reality she had just entered, we're met with an AI ringmaster, Kane, who is an absolute lunatic. But quite frankly, one of the interesting points about Kane is obviously being AI, he's not equipped to really understand or comprehend the human psyches behind those who would end up finding themselves trapped in his circus, which I mean, he's not even human, so of course he's inexperienced with that nature. However, with how he administers the adventures in the circus, he also lacks the understanding of the complexity of human psyches, which, don't get me wrong, his adventures are pretty sick, but at the same time, Kane is also very misguided with how he handles it because of his limited perspective of the humanity side, and that's what makes him such a complex sort of figure as basically the host of this circus. And at the same time, it makes me feel like he's not really purposeful with how he intentionally exhibits harms on his characters. More so it's just him not directly understanding the fundamental side of human emotion. So while he does come off as a bit of an antagonistic figure, I don't think it hones in on the true like villainous, well, because of how indirect the effects he has on others due to his limited understanding. But anyways, speaking about other characters, there are also other humans who ended up finding themselves trapped in the circus as well. Raggeda, this ragdoll who latches onto this positive and cheerful personality, though with that said, her peers start to question how genuine it comes off as, where her overt positive nature comes off a bit forceful, which did lead to a lot of theories surrounding her. However, it does get recontextualized in a later episode that helps us understand the lore. Jax, this purple funny bunny who is an overtly narcissistic presence, who is constantly a dick towards everyone, exhibiting this shtick where he can't even take situations seriously. And while I personally know that Jax is a very popular character from this show, very polarizing too, as his character in particular really divides the audience, where for me personally, I am not going on this Jax hate bandwagon, as I have this strange reverence for his character, believing there is a truer side to him that pertains to his mischievous nature, and boy does it get emphasized in a few episodes later on. So while his behavior is something that I wouldn't approve of, it does still make him a pretty riveting character because there's character so much to really assess him on. We got Kinger, who is just this insane king chess piece who supposedly has been there longer than anyone else, but his lively persona felt like too much to take at face value, and when understanding on his past more that gets gleaned on in a later episode, it does make him a more of a likable and affable character, especially with how much he can embrace the fatherly figure mold. Then there's Gangle, this ribbon-built body that connects to a porcelain mask, where she constantly has her comedy mask splitting, which does fundamentally represent her demeanor of being pretty reserved and sourced, though she has the willingness to embrace a multitude of moods stemming from the form of her mask. And Zubul, who is this like mixed match toy that has a very grouchy persona who always likes to preserve themselves, especially on a couple of Kane's adventures, and while we don't really know why, around a point later on where they truly start to give their voice, that it contextualizes their lack of enthusiasm in such sort that makes them very distinct of a character. But then now we have our main character who can't even remember her own name, because once a human joins the world, their own name is going to be blank out of their mind. So our protagonist would be given the name of Pomni, so she's given a quick tour around the circus and still showing signs of denial while she's processing everything. That's when she is guided by Jackson Ragada to meet another character, Hoffmo, who wasn't present at her entrance, and the reason for that is that he abstracted, which this is the aspect that becomes the biggest horror shtick of this show, where an abstraction stems from a character who basically loses their mind, and this facet becomes a looming threat that creates a lot of the anxiety throughout the episodes as we begin to grow this really big investment to all of the characters. So it tends to evoke a lot of the anxiety from the audience of who may be subjected to suffering that fate eventually, which, spoiler alert, no one has as of right now, but it is still plausible, and in my opinion, I do feel like there will be a couple abstractions, as it would feel a bit too nonsensical to introduce this threat only for it to not have any sort of effect moving forward. Though, is this something that I would personally want it to happen to our characters? No, but do I feel like storytelling wise, it does feel viable to eventually occur. But either way, with Kaufmo abstracting, he attacks Ragada and Pomni, to which the latter essentially abandons the former, and earlier in the episode, she spotted an exit door during her tour and comes across it again and tries to go through it, and at a point reaches the void, to which King gets notified of it and brings Pomni back to the circus and places Kaufmo in a cellar where the other abstracted characters would be placed. And while this ordeal happened, we had another story plot where Zubul had to be saved after being torn apart, and I'll be honest, I didn't really put too much care into those segments. I was mostly focused on Pomni's side of things, but now Pomni, being basically dazed by everything, is trying to maintain her composure while still trying to comprehend everything that just went down, which is how the first episode culminates and really sets up the horrifying theme of this series as we move along. So then we get to episode 2. Pomni has a nightmare where she's about to abstract and gets thrown into the cellar, with this seeming like it really induces the fear in her mind as she's continuing to process her mindset being stuck in this place. On top of that, it does feel like it really starts to develop this existential journey for Pomni and the story arc that she's going to be relishing. So anyways, she gets joined by Ragada and the others, who are sent on their next adventure, which is in a candy world outside of Zubul, who opts out of it. So our characters are tasked to retrieve maple syrup from bandits who are just gummy crocodiles. So our gang is on hot pursuit in a truck, which they eventually reach those bandits side by side with their truck, and Jax throws Pomni out of a moving truck, and she basically has this somewhat Van Damme moment of stretching out while holding on to two moving trucks, though she's not doing the splits, but still, her arms can really stretch like elastic. But anyways, the trucks eventually collide with the gangs falling into a river of fudge, which Jax humorously has this Looney Tunes sort of visual of him being able to physically balance upright as he's vertically falling down into the river with everyone else. Like, bro literally defied the physics. Meanwhile, we have Pomni and one of the bandits named Gamiku glitch out of the map that leads them into his weird zone where they're just all alone together, and this is where we get a very wholesome moment between the two, where Gamiku, because he is an NPC, he does suffer this like existential crisis, which obviously him being an NPC means that he's not really human. However, he seems to be very equipped with some level of human psyche as he's expressing this state of distress, not feeling any sort of sense of value. And this deeper meaning behind existential crisis is something that can really resonate with a lot of the audience, where even the character who is an NPC still finds its way to serve a purpose, to evoke a reality with a human essence. But anyways, Pomni takes the moment to give him such immense comfort, really finding commonality between him and her, and it starts this little arc with Pomni where she becomes this sort of figure who learns and understands a lot of the deep meanings behind each of the characters she interacts with, and sought out the tax to mediate the situation with others, and many of those cases are approached in different sort of styles in cases that they are not direct. But anywho, on top of that, Pomni also gives the offering for Gummigoo to join the circus with her gang. So they're finding a way out and reunite with everyone, where what happened with everyone while they were away, they were just dealing with some fudge monster who also had a similar role with Gummigoo not really feeling much valued and was offered by Jax to be returned to the kingdom. Though he does get flattened when Pomni and Gummigoo return, to which everyone now heads back to the Candy Kingdom where they return the syrup, to which the gang plus Gummigoo all leave through the portal, with one last sadistic trick Jax does in allowing the fudge monster back into the kingdom, which we don't actually get a visual of, but we can tell everything got fudged up there once the gang left. But anyways, as Gummigoo was about to settle himself in the circus, Yang, noticing him as an NPC, completely wipes him out, much to a lot of the shock of the audience and Pomni. But anyways, we also have Kaufmo's funeral segment, even though he's not actually gone, he's just abstracted and it's just in the cellar. But yeah, Jax refuses to be present there, which is kind of a sign for what's to come with him down the road. But anyways, this is where Pomni really starts to ingratiate herself within the circus, and I think her journey, starting from this like panicky and sense of denial to a sudden 180, feeling more immersed in the environment and actually beginning to find some common ground, is vastly unique. And also because how much she is the linchpin of our experience with the show, it so makes her journey to be very relatable, and her interactions with others being the luxury of her strong development. And now that takes us to episode 3, with Pomni experimenting with her effects while she holds her breath, which is essentially a huge shift, while everyone else's effects are different, with them being outlined outside of Jax, who never actually explains what happens to him when he holds his breath, which he leaves it up to the viewers. So that leads to theoretical material. But anyways, Kane's next adventure for the characters to go on is through a haunted house, which was something that was actually trying to cater towards Zubul, but once again, Zubul chose to neglect another adventure. So while the gang ventured themselves around the house, King searches around to find Zubul, which turns out he didn't really need to, because he can single-handedly just summon them straight to him. So we then get to this sequence of Zubul basically getting a therapy session from him, where like I said before, Kane does not really have the knowledge to truly understand the human psychology and sorts, so he doesn't have much worth of this time. However, the audience, us real humans ourselves, had the chance to understand Zubul more deeply, where they open up their fundamental issues of just being their physical appearance themselves, which that sentiment speaks to dysmorphia, and is a pretty sad state for someone like Zubul to be in, especially with the body that they were assigned entering the circus, which is easily removable and a case where there's not really much a resolution to it. And this notion really makes me sympathize with Zubul more and gives a lot more of a sharper understanding of why they have been preserving themselves from these adventures, because of their uncomfortability with their own physical appearance. And while I don't think the subplot had any sort of proper closure to it, at least we got to know more in depth on Zubul's character. And talking about the therapy session more broadly, it was just a humorous sequence that I had to watch so many times because I was constantly entertained by some of Kane's wacky moments in it. As well, we have a little short part where Zubul basically illustrates everyone's personas.
That's just too nice to say anything. Jax just likes to f*** with everybody. Gangle's too shy to speak up. Kinger's insane. And Pomni, she looks traumatized every time she comes back from one.
And then the cherry on top being Zubul and Kane switching roles, which I'm definitely sure an AI definitely needs therapy, but still, what an amusing role reversal there. But anyways, enough of that subplot, let's go to the haunted mansion. At this point, there's too much trauma being inflicted, and Pomni herself, who's only just been enduring this non-stop, can't even get a moment to breathe, no pun intended. But then she and Kinger get separated from the group, and while the remaining just find their way through the mansion smoothly, even getting a tea party with a ghost, except for Jax, who was tied up because of his antics, they still need to wait for Kinger and Pomni to reunite with them, so that there is full assembly as they leave the mansion. So what Pomni and King are up to is trying to find their way out of where they're at, and they do make some horrifying encounters while trying to escape, which one in particular starts causing Kinger to daze off, which the sight of what it is reminds him of something very sentimental to him. So after the ordeal Kinger and Pomni go through and eventually landing them in hell, so then we get this interaction between the two where it's such a heartwarming sequence that had Kinger reveal a lot more about himself and why he exhibits these kind of erratic behavior. And that stems from an unfortunate tragedy of losing his wife Queenie to abstraction, where there's an interesting detail where despite abstraction, Kinger was able to at least calm down his abstracted wife, especially in like the dark atmosphere. So when he's finding his way into some sort of dark environment, it restores his memories about his beloved wife who he clearly had a strong dynamic with, and it does really recontextualize a lot of who Kinger is and how he essentially suffers from dementia situation. And it's a very sad case, but also shows how King Kinger is able to seek his adjustments to ensure that he is able to cherish enough of what he can of his good memories with his wife. And it's like at this capacity that makes Kinger's character a lot more legible to read, and from what I've seen really did shift a lot of the audience viewpoints on Kinger, making him a very beloved and well-liked character after this particular episode. And yeah, I really sympathize with him too, much like everyone else. But his case is more interesting as he's been there a very long time, so he's been coping through this for quite so long. And honestly, this was all really touching. And I'm glad this also continues Pomni's arc, where she can be able to be this figure that people are willing to gradually open up to. So now after that, they eventually find their escape out of hell by using the held breath tactic that was experimented earlier, so that was some interesting foreshadowing. But they reunite with everyone and are able to now check themselves out of the haunted house adventure. But yeah, this was so much depth that we got mostly into Kinger's end and gave us a lot more of a new perspective on him, where he's basically faced with a lot of trauma from his tragic loss and equivalent to his unfortunate nature of dementia. It just further expands on this level of despair on Kinger's life. But despite all this, he sought his way to keep up his compassion and is able to maintain that to avoid losing his sanity that would contribute to an abstraction. And I think it is perfectly what his wife would have wanted him to do in a tragic scenario that did end up occurring. And equivalent to that, we also had this death on Zubul, although not as impactful as Kinger's, still has some grounds to it that makes their situation equally somber like Kinger's. Episode 4 becomes this Gangle-centric episode where Zubul kindly gives her a new plastic mask that keeps her happy, which would end up becoming the embodiment to represent a relatively common mental disorder, which the narrative of this is in conjunction with the fast food employment adventure the characters would go on outside of Kinger, who just ends up riding on a bull. Well, Gangle ends up becoming the manager of this fast food chain and assigns shift to everyone, and periodically we see how her manager role begins to take a toll on her, hence her interactions with her employees, with a lazy Jax who doesn't even give a crap about doing much of his shift, and then starts this little cycle of provoking Gangle's depression, which we do get those signs with her internal crack, and then her interaction with Ragita, who is very drowsy after a debacle with the stupid sauce that did cause her to hallucinate a horrific visual of Gangle's face, which I'll be honest, I wasn't as creeped out as much others, but still very much what's needed to enhance this shtick of this horror comedy. But after Ragita calls Gangle annoying, it really starts to make her reach her supposed breaking point, and seeing how she's internally cracking instead of externally with usually her mask goes to show how that plastic mask becomes this embodiment to portray this mold of bipolar depression, where the whole desire of this mask was her attempt to try and stay happy. However, with everything that's going down, it's just starting to mess with her mindset as her depression starts to skyrocket, which does lead into a manic episode she endures at the end, with her now depression seeming to really skyrocket, which this scene is really dark when you think about it in how it truly parallels with the reality of the psychological issue. And though with Gangle seeming to be out of it and in a near abstraction moment, she is quickly saved thanks to Pomni still being present at her shift and offers to close a restaurant for her, which does lead to Gangle ending her shift and chucking that plastic mask to feel free of masking her true emotions. And widely, I think also in conjunction to this adventure, which feels so grounded in reality. With that said, the pacing of it definitely didn't feel as intriguing or sort compared to the previous, but the theme of it does potentially elicit resonance and relatability, and also this whole plotline involving Gangle becomes a very somber narrative that grounds the reality of where this mental disorder can really drive someone into a loss of sanity, which that sequence of Gangle epitomizes that notion. And I just like how once again Pomni is able to mediate someone's issue, while I will say doesn't feel as direct to Gangle's cause, still something that continues this streak of her trying to moderate others' internal distress. And in episode 5, the characters don't really get a moment to breathe in terms of adventures to go on, but this episode really does give us emphasis on the lore behind the personal backstories of each of our beloved characters. Basically, we have them going through lightning rounds of adventure, where the first few we got was pretty nonsensical, but I'll admit, the little anime adventure was pretty surreal. But anyways, then we get to the stargazing adventure, where we get an early start to the lore behind Jax, which is all attributed by a line that Ragita unconsciously delivers that Jax doesn't have friends anymore, which results in him glaring at her, which clearly shows signs that his sophisticated behavior has been stemming from his post-traumatic experience, where it seems like due to his loss of his friends, which is clearly from abstraction, has taken a toll on his behavior, where he just has been embracing this mischievous mold to basically act as his coping mechanism. And all of this really starts to develop this insight on Jax's context behind his mischievous persona. And I think the show does give us some quick glimpses to everything surrounding it, where you can catch it during Kane's intermission segment, where he passes by by a room with a frog character on it, which further adds to the intricacies behind this. But now, with Pawnee being in the know of this would be the start of her bond with Jax that I'm sure a lot of people were hoping that would develop to be a very strong dynamic duo, which that definitely didn't last long, as I'll talk about it more in the next episode. But then we get to the bar sequence, which this is where we truly get the lore behind everyone's backgrounds, where we basically get to learn more about their previous lives prior to their imprisonment in the digital circus. We did garner a lot of interesting backstories from like Pawnee describing her seek for mild thrills, especially when working in a job that bores her, and Zubul is on par with that, trying to seek a sense of thrill, where they also work in a second job as a tattoo artist, which was pertained to their response to Gengu, who did have a somber backstory of previously working in a fast food chain, which hey, that was the adventure last time, and it quickly grounds the reality of Gengu's previous life. And on top of all this, she had the desire to be a graphics designer, but ultimately dropped out of the college that she attended. But then we get to probably the most compelling backstory, Ragada, who was born with a very rich family, but unfortunately has a very strained relationship with her mother, which although the show doesn't emphasize on it, when you understand and analyze more deeply behind the implications of what she said, it is a very sorrowing case that she has been through, and it makes Ragada comes off extremely more sympathetic when you realize the full breakdown of her past. On top of that, it does truly start eliciting why Ragada embraces this supportive figure mold, I guess trying to avoid basically making parallels how her mother was to her, and trying to be forceful with this positive persona to not put her fellow peers in her own shoes. And I think this is an interesting coping mechanism that she does, but also at the same time, it does contrast to how Jax enforces his, which I already had broke down earlier. But it does lead to this very complex dynamic between the two, where they embrace two vastly different sticks to cope with their traumas. And also, now to talk about Jax, one interesting thing that sort of signifies his past life is his fear of a corn, which the context surrounding it does seem a bit shallow. However, if you do take the time to analyze the deep meaning surrounding the corn, you will understand that it is a crop that is normally harvested, and where does that come from? A farm. And so basically, based on what this is, it seems like Jax came from a farm life that I guess didn't really go well for him. So the sight of a corn in particular, giving him that PTSD, does lean in on his fearfulness of it. So anyways, now we get to the final adventure, which was softball, and all the characters outside of Gangle get an evil clone slash counterpart of themselves as the opposing team. And while we just had some fun character moments, especially Jax becoming a maid thanks to Gangle, it's not until that we have this conversation between Ragada and Pomni where the latter tries to encourage Ragada to truly start breaking out of her zone a bit and express this assertive mold that needs to be let out at a point. And so she does follow through with that in her interaction with Jack after seeing how he's starting to basically pull Pomni away from the positive mold, which leads to her expressing her outrage at him, which really established this side of her behavior that she's been trying to mask off with her forced persona. And while she does get told off by Pomni, despite having to be reminded that that's what she was encouraged to do, she does express remorse for her temper, and especially towards Jax after what she said earlier, which shifts his expression once again, continuing this deep plot behind his behavior, which Pomni does try to probe for answers from him, which by the end of the episode, he does start formulating this chemistry friendship with Pomni, much to Ragada's dismay as she's facing this potential reality of things crumbling down around her. And I personally believe this episode was well written to intrigue for what's to come in the following episode. And then that leads us to the most recent episode as of this recording, episode 6, where might be recency bias, but this is probably the most well written episode with everything that had just unfolded. And this being the true deep exploration behind Jax's character that was partially set up in the previous episode, though it didn't have much dividends to it. This episode wasted no time but to really ground all of that. And to illustrate that, we continue on with this blooming bond between Jax and Pomni, to which we are then led to an adventure within the circus itself that involves teams, and we have Gangle and Zubul pair up. But then when it comes to who was going to be paired with Jax, Pomni closed that potential debate with Ragada despite some hesitations, as Ragada is still iffy on the potential bond that Pomni has with Jax that is going to shape her up to be equally mischievous like him. But Pomni still opts to partner up with Jax, so Ragada is left in a team with Kinger. So then we have this adventure with guns commencing where they have to shoot each other, where we have another sequence with Jax and Pomni basically having this bond about archetypes that Jax spearheaded the conversation, which I guess does start fueling Pomni to embrace this chaotic arc for her, and we see the two of them being able to successfully shoot down both Ragada and Kinger, which leads to another very heartfelt moment with Ragada being in a devastating state where she essentially feels like she let down Pomni like she let down Jax. And I think this now really starts to cement how generous her empathy has been for others. And you know what? It is a saddening feeling for her, but she has someone like Kinger who she can open up to, especially since they were in a team. So clearly there is someone who's willing to have conversations with her. But you can really feel for Ragada in this spot, where it seems that Jax has now been officially pulling Pomni away from her, which has led to her feeling left out. And I do have that sort of relatability with her. And it is a sucky feeling to feel pushed away, especially with the kind of persona that she's been relishing, where it was equivalent to her trying to avoid following her mom's footsteps that we learned of her backstory in the previous episode. So I was really liking what the show did here to emphasize the authenticity with her behavior and that she truly feels this sort of kindness and empathy for others. And then we have another moment following this between Gangle and Zubul, where we've seen how these two have started getting really closer in these last few episodes, and this time it really peaks with this scene with Zubul essentially mediating Gangle after how fearful she is with Jax. And although the masks that she possesses is representative of her emotions, she's more better off caring for who she is in reality, which this conversation really cheers her up. And I think Zubul does some great work in propping up Gangle's mood, to where she doesn't seem as overt in a somber state as she usually was. But anyways, the round continues on and Gangle eventually falls victim to Jax and Pomni's shooting. So then it all comes down to Zubul, who finds refuge in their own room, and while they're loading up their guns, Jax and Pomni humorously sing Daisy Bell, which I can't tell you how much I just love repeating this part, just with how much the two are really making a meal out of this. But after they complete the song, Karma comes munching them up and Zubul gets the upper hand on the two, putting them down to 1 life. But eventually with Pomni's skilled ricochet method, she's able to take down Zubul, where she and Jax make the final blow on them. And then after that, as Pomni hugs Jax in honor of their teamwork, where we truly see Jax's nature of, where he starts to quickly realize his facade starting to slowly crumble, so he pushes Pomni away. And there's an important detail here where he just stares at his glove as Pomni aims her gun at him to have what she supposedly thought this mutual thing, but as Jax takes notice, he just lays down his sword, or let's just say gun, and essentially is allowing Pomni to shoot him, because all this stems from his fear of showing any sort of emotional feelings or care for others. So his way of ensuring to stay on phase with that is to essentially push others away from him, and he's actively doing so in this moment with Pomni. And while she's trying to probe him, he continues to scoff at her and encourages her to shoot him, saying that they were never friends or team to begin with. And this whole segment was written very well, and I give an immense amount of props to Gooseworx and Glitch for all of this great storytelling. And it's just the kind of narrative that has gotten me really invested into this series and pulled me in as I'm watching this in the midst of the series still ongoing. But anyways, after this constant backtracking from Jax and things getting a bit more heated when she brings up cough mode, this is when we get to Pomni's crucial question of what he would do if she happened to abstract. With although the scene only showed a visual of his back, you can see how his gestures really showed that he started having some feelings, but the realization got to his head quickly, so he brushed her off by saying he would move on and forget about her as a way to scoff off the potential feeling that he was essentially afraid of showing. But for Jax's sake, it's kind of too late to really mask that at this point, as he kind of opened up a bit too much to Pomni, where she has started to see right through him, and so that essentially led to Jax's state of constant denial, as it's somewhat apparent to him that his facade is starting to fall apart. And this all leads up to Pomni escalating all of this by having a tussle with him, essentially trying to get him to prove that he has feelings and any sort of shtick, which he unfortunately fails to comply by not fighting back. And that already epitomizes that Pomni's theories of him are correct, stemming from him not fighting her back as well as trying to let her win the game. So now after that fight, Jax, in a desperate situation to maintain his mischievous mask, basically tries to claim that he does not care for her or anyone else and that everyone is his playthings and he will enjoy their suffering, which all that is really reflective on the true nature of him that is equivalent to his mischievous ways as his approach to coping, as he's also going through a lot of trauma too. But then again, as we progressed through the series, we got to understand more deeply on his personal context. And earlier, I did mention that I have this strange reverence for Jax, and yes, I still do. Because while, yes, he can be a jerk and does tick off a lot of the fan base, which I wouldn't approve of his behavior either. However, he's the kind of character that always makes me interested to understand the whys of them all, because there has to be a reasoning surrounding his shtick. And as we start learning more in these last couple episodes, it makes me start to have this sense of investment into him, where it's been abundantly clear that he does have this good side of him that has had blatant signs of, but every time he came close to it, he just had to find ways to backtrack from it, as is equivalent to his fear of it. Which, I mean, to be fair, him actively rejecting the chances to finally embrace it does make him partially irredeemable, but I say partially because I still feel like there can be an opportunity for Jax to do a switcheroo. And even though there has been talks from developers themselves about Jax's case, I am taking it at face value and we'll just see where it goes from here. And I also want to give props to Michael Kovic, who voiced Jax, and he was just wonderful with giving a solid delivery on him with the incredible tone and such sort. Like, it kind of gives out that somewhat charm that makes me really invested into what his character truly entails. And honestly, this is gratification for him for taking that voice role. But wow, I've talked too long about that. Now let's just get to the end part where the characters now settle themselves in audience seat for a little ceremony, and Jax Jax isolates himself from everyone, and in this moment of him alone, we can see how he is very remorseful for his actions as he's feeling depressed over what he had done to Kalamity, which then leads to a complex situation that causes him to dash over to the sink to calm himself down, which there has been speculation that it was a near abstraction moment, which I don't think it's out of a realm of possibility, especially where it truly signifies how he's unable to contain his facade. But anyways, he's able to calm himself for a bit and heads back to his seat while the awards were being announced. But yeah, this was one hell of an episode that has started to shift a lot of the audience's intrigue on the series as it continues to get exciting. And I'll take a moment to talk briefly about the upcoming episode 7, which we only had a trailer drop down and a couple of screenshot leaks that is still hype inducing. And based on what we got, it seems like the story plot may be shifting again and probably to a trajectory where now the characters are going to try and find their way to escape, which will be interesting to see. And while we got word from the developers that this episode may divide the audience, though does invoke our anxiety, also plays into the intrigue coming into it. And likewise, with this episode just around the corner, I will make an individual review on it, so keep your eyes out for that. So from everything that we have gotten from the show, it didn't miss. It's like able to find this sort of charm and theme that elicits reaction and investment. And it's very interesting too that not only are they really blending it with this like horror comedy in store, they're also shifting away from this mold of making characters just be characters and instead finding more deeper meanings behind who they are. And I genuinely think that is a strong direction where the show has went for. And at this case, it seems like Glitch has positioned themselves in easy competition against Disney where they beat them at their own game. Its strong suit is really the portrayal of our characters, where the show takes the honor to hone in on each of them more deeply, giving them much more depth that evokes a lot of resonation that we can latch onto. And the developers in Glitch and Gooseworx have been absolutely nailing it. And with only 3 episodes left, with the next episode coming out in a bit, it's going to get exciting to see how the remainder play out. And hopefully, now that we got to know all the characters, we're going to start developing a new narrative of maybe finding an escape route or finding some sort of secrets that have been gatekept from them. Like, this show has been very strong with its grouping along with its wacky comedy and fresh sort of drama that doesn't feel so oversaturated, that make each episode feel its own sort of shtick and bring something different to the table. And I absolutely enamor that. So yeah, I've been loving the peak comedy that this cartoon has been giving, and as amazing as it is worth checking out while you have the chance to enjoy the thrill as it is still ongoing. Let me know what you guys think of this show in the comments below, and with that, tap that like and tap subscribe for more anime and media coverage like this. That's all I gotta say, and I appreciate you guys tuning in.